So the first thing I want to say is if you hear any weird background noise, it is my, we've got the A1 tree service here today. They were supposed to come next Wednesday to take down some trees, and they called this morning and said, hey, can we come today instead? So right now I think they're taking lunch, but just in case they start working again and things get weird, just wanted you to know that that's what's going on.
So did you get estimates?
What's that?
We need some trees done. Did you get any estimates from other people, or did you
No,
know them?
we just went with them. They've done trees for us before, and they're awesome, and we love them. So we just went with them.
Okay, I'll call them and say, Katie Schwartz said to call you.
Yeah, this is our second big job with them. So, and we accommodated them today.
We use A1 trees.
Yeah, that's who we got. Yep. Yeah, if you call them today, they might even give you a discount because they're really happy with us since we were willing to let them come today instead of next week. They drove all the way up to, I think she said Round Mountain. And then when they arrived, the lady said, you know what, it's too windy today. I'm afraid that there's going to be a fire if you work today, so I don't want you to do it. Well, why did you have us drive all the way out here if you're going to cancel on us at the last minute? So the girl in the office was calling me in a panic looking for a job for them to do today. So they were happy that I said sure.
All right, cool.
So talk to Jamie and tell her that I sent you.
Jamie?
Jamie, yeah. All right.
You can also tell them the Bechtels recommend them too.
There you go.
I guess it's a God thing.
They drop all over the place.
And let Katie lead the course.
Yes, let's talk about some faith as a verb. So I chose for our program here for our 5 weeks a kind of a theme verse, if you will. I chose Acts 17:28a. In him we live and move and have our being. And so the idea being that faith is not just about what we believe, what is inside our heads. It's about how we live our lives, how we act, how we embody who it is that we are. I can give you a little preview. Next week, my little message for all ages is going to talk about the choices that we make in our lives and how it is the series of choices that we make that create who we are and what our life is about. And so I think that when we're talking about interpreting situations and figuring out how to respond faithfully, that the most important thing for us to remember is that when we are navigating these things, when we're trying to figure out what to do, that this is all about God being central in our lives. It's all about, forming who we are to reflect who God is to the best of our ability. And obviously that's not something that we can do perfectly, but it's something that God is there to help us with. So what I want to do today as kind of an introduction before we get into the main process of how to navigate this interpretational task is just to provide some conceptual background ideas for us to keep in mind as we're moving forward. So I wanted to just start out with mentioning that humans are natural interpreters. So the idea of interpreting a situation theologically is not something that is foreign to us as humans. So I wanted to walk you through just this little, let's see, can I get this to go up here? Trying. There we go. So humans as our natural interpreters, even from the very beginning. So I wanted to talk to you about this thing. As a toddler, you may have encountered this for the first time in the kitchen. Your parent may have handed it to you, probably in chopped up form, not hopefully whole hog like this if you're a toddler, and said, this is an apple. And so you as a human will look at this object. You'll notice that it is spherical, that it's 3-dimensional. You can touch it. You can see that it is a little bit soft potentially, but also firm. You can see that it's red. And because you're in the context of the kitchen, you can probably assume that the purpose of it is to put it in your mouth. It's food. So then later, you are reading with your parent perhaps, and you see this picture in the book. And your parent says, this is an apple. And so now you have to interpret what that means. So you already have seen an apple, an in-person apple, an actual apple, a three-dimensional apple. And when you see this picture, your brain is saying, well, gosh, this is the same thing as that other thing that I saw, but now it's flat. It is inside a book. In the new context, this is probably not food, although as a toddler, you might, try to taste the book and see if it is food or not. But it's a little bit different than the physical solid apple that you were given before. So now you're trying to put together in your mind what this concept is all about. What is the concept apple in your mind? So at this point, you start to understand that an apple can be something that is represented in pictures, but it's also a physical object. But we've got some things that are similar. It still has that roundness to it. It's still red. It still has that stem, perhaps. And so you can look at that in the book, and even though you know that that is not actually the apple, you can look at it and you can say, yum. You know that that is something that is edible. So then maybe later you were handed this. Anybody recognize this one? I had one of these. So now we're back to three-dimensional. We've still got red, we've still got stem, we've got leaf, but is this the same thing as the original apple that we were given in the first place? No. You can touch it, it's not the same consistency, you can't bite into it, it doesn't have the juice in it. This is not the same thing as the original, but this is still called apple. And so now we have to complexify our understanding of what apple is again. But again, we still have these similarities. It's red, it's round. It represents this concept of apple, the original apple that we saw at the very beginning in the kitchen. And again, where you see it, how the person interacts with it is going to change the way that you interpret it. So now we've got this concept. An apple is a round red object that either can be eaten or represents something that can be eaten. So then maybe you are being babysat by your grandma and she comes and you're in the kitchen and she hands you this. And she says, here's an apple. Well, now what do you do? Because we've got this concept in our minds of what is an apple. And then we are completely thrown for a loop here. We still have that roundness, but we've lost the red. Bless you. So now what do we do? And this is how interpretation works. This is how growth works. As we encounter new information within a category, we have to wrestle with what that means for the concept that we're trying to create in our minds. So I wanted to do the same thing with all of you and see what you think. And I'd like to do it with the concept chair. So who would like to be brave and express to us what is a chair? Anybody? This can be a group project.
Well, it's something to sit on.
Okay, something to sit on.
One person can sit on it.
Ah, okay. We've got a chair to look at over here. So it's for one person to sit on.
Maybe.
And Steve showed us a chair, so it's got some legs on it. It's got a back. So just by pure happenstance, I have something very similar to what Steve showed us here with my picture. So
It's got a place for your rear end.
yep, you put your bottom there, and it's got some legs to hold you up so that you don't fall on the floor. It's got a back to support you. Is it always brown? Perhaps not. So these are all concepts that come along with the concept chair. But then we can start to complexify this concept. Is this a chair?
It's a stool.
A stool.
Subspecies.
Different species, okay. So this is still something that you sit on. It still has legs, but not the same number of legs. It has no back. So is a stool a subset of chair, or is it its own completely different concept? How do we understand that? And I'm being very pedantic here on purpose, because when
So
we're
is this
thinking,
like the difference between a Great Dane and a Schnauzer?
yes, potentially. So if we are, if we're trying to conceptualize what is a chair, and we describe it as an object that has a place to put your bottom, it's got 4 legs, it's got a back, and then somebody offers you a stool, then in your concept map, stool does not fit under chair. Stool is its own completely separate idea. And that might not seem to matter so much, but for some people, stool can be chair. It might be a sub chair, so a chair is something you sit on. But then underneath that, there are several different types of chairs, like stools and regular chairs and other types of things. But then you can even go further than that, and you can say, so what about, for example, you're walking down the street and you get tired. There's no chair anywhere, so you sit down on the curb. Because you have now sat on it, is a curb a chair? We are interpreting all the time, and we don't even realize that we're doing it.
Well, and I was going to say, it kind of depends on your environment. You gave the example of walking down the street. You could be out hiking and, here's a log to sit on.
Right. So is the log a chair? I don't think most people would say yes. It falls under that concept chair, but it is still something that you can sit on. So chair is not the only thing that can be sat on, but perhaps chair is the only thing that is intended to be sat on. The purpose of a chair is to be sat on, whereas the purpose of a log is not necessarily to be sat on, although it can be sat on. So you see, you can go on this forever. We won't belabor this forever. But the idea is that how you interpret the world happens automatically. Is that something I can sit on? Is that a chair? And other people might interpret it differently. You might see the log and you might say, yes, that'll make a good chair. Somebody else might see the log and say, oh no, that looks too bumpy to me. That's gonna hurt my delicate behind. There's no way I'm sitting on that rough bark. That's not a chair. I need to find something else. And so the way that each individual interprets things based on their own past experiences, based on the context that they're in, maybe that same person who wouldn't sit on the bumpy log under normal circumstances is just exhausted after this hike, and so must find somewhere to sit down, and this is good enough. I will consider this to be my chair for the moment. So all of these things impact the way that we interpret the world around us, but we do all of these things automatically. We don't even think about the way that it's happening. So there are, according to smart people who think and write about these things, there are 5 moments, 5 distinct things that happen in the course of our encountering of a situation that needs to be interpreted that we don't even do, we don't do it consciously, but this is what happens. So the first step is actually before the new encounter. which is pre-understanding. So pre-understanding is the collection of all of your previous interpretations. If we're talking about the apple, this is all of your previous encounters with the concept apple and your interpretations of those encounters. So we've got the actual physical apple that you saw and you held in your hand and you ate. Then we've got the picture of the apple from the book, and the idea that not all apples are spherical and three-dimensional and edible. Then we've got the toy apple that adds new complexities to the concept of apple. And now we bring all of those things with us, including, the context that we saw it in and the negative or positive experience that we had with it. Maybe we ate some of the apple at the beginning and we liked it. And so now apples are a positive thing. Our interpretation of apple is positive. Or maybe we didn't like it, and so our interpretation of apple is negative. Or maybe we tried to eat the toy apple and had a bad experience with that because it didn't work out and it hurt our mouth. And so now we have a negative understanding of apple, and so our interpretation of apple is negative. We bring all of these things with us when we encounter new situations that need to be interpreted. So the second moment, the second thing that happens is you come up short. Something happens that calls into question an element of your pre-understanding of all of your previous interpretations. So we are confronted with a green apple for the first time. What do we do with this? My previous interpretations, my previous experiences of apple do not allow me to easily understand what's happening here with green apple. What's going on here? We've come up short. We don't have enough information. We don't have enough interpretation to handle this. So what are we going to do? So the next thing we do is dialogue. Dialogue is the interplay of the new information with our pre-understanding. So what do we already know about apple? Well, what we think we know is that it's round and red and in person spherical and edible. When you squeeze it, it's a little bit squishy but fairly firm for the most part. And when you bite into it, it's juicy and has a particular type of flavor to it. So these are the things that we know about apple. And we interact with that information, kind of interacts with the new information. Well, we've got this item here. The person that gave it to me claims it's an apple. It has the shape of an apple. It has the firmness level of an apple. If I am brave enough to bite into it, it tastes fairly much like an apple. It has the same texture as an apple, but it's green. So what do I do with this? Is there enough evidence here for me to modify my understanding of the concept apple to include this new color, this modified understanding, or not? And this is all happening automatically when we encounter this information. So the fourth thing that happens is fusion. All of your previous interpretations, your collection of pre-understanding, yields space to the new information or ideas to the degree that it needs to. But also the new ideas are shaped by your previous interpretations. So like I said, if you have had a positive experience of the concept apple in the past, then the new apple, the green apple, will potentially come into your fused new interpretational collection in a positive way. Whereas if you've had negative experiences of apple in the past, then it will be different. Other types of experiences too will come into play. If you are, if you've eaten the veggie straws that have the different flavors and colors to them. Some of them are made out of sweet potato, some of them are made out of spinach, some of them are made out of regular potatoes, and you only like the yellow ones that are made out of standard potatoes. You don't like the green ones that are made out of spinach. Then you might say, I don't like that green apple, because you've tasted a type of food before that has multiple colors, and green was not one that you liked. And so you can automatically assume your interpretation is that this is going to taste terrible and I won't even try it. We get this a lot, obviously, with young children. And so the previous interpretations, our pre-understanding is changed by this new encounter and bringing in this new idea. But the new idea itself is also shaped by our previous interpretations, by our previous experiences, as it's brought in. And then finally, we apply the new information. So we change the way that we experience the world. We change the way that we interact with the world because of this new encounter. So now that we know that an apple can be green, when we see another green fruit-like object, perhaps we will think that it's an apple. We might be wrong because it's a pear, but we've never encountered a pear before, and so we don't have that concept. But when we encounter it, that will give us a new experience, and then we'll start to differentiate even further between now not just red apples and green apples, but red apples, green apples, and pears. And so our interpretational experience grows so that we can more accurately interpret the world around us as we age. So any questions, comments about that? Does this make sense?
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So these are all things that we do automatically. We don't even think about it. This is, from our very first experiences in the world that we can't remember as infants. This is how we learn. This is how we grow. This is how we create
Right.
the structure of how the world works. But
Yeah,
these are
this
all
is learning.
important for us as we try to be more intentional about the way that we are interpreting our world. So another important thing to keep in mind is the work of a philosopher named Jean Piaget. He wanted to make sure that we understood there's a hierarchy of how we encounter new information and what it is that we attempt to do with it. So he's kind of more talking about that dialogue part of the moments. So he suggests that we encounter new information, we come up short, and the first thing that we try to do is we attempt to assimilate the information. So if the new information does not cause us any kind of major upheaval in the way that our system is already set up in our minds, of the way that particular concept is understood and interpreted, then we can just take that information and we can add it in. Oh, well, this is a new apple, but I've already seen a green apple before, and so this is no big deal. I can just bring in this new interpretation, this new experience, and move along. Not a problem at all. But if the new information is so different from what we've previously experienced that we can't just easily absorb it, then we have to accommodate it. We have to change more on what we already know, and our previous interpretations, our foundational pre-understanding system has to change a lot more than we are comfortable with. And that's what accommodation is. Accommodation requires that we change our understanding, that we modify the system into which we are attempting to bring this new information. And so Piaget says that if you come across this kind of situation where you come up short and you don't want to do the work of accommodating, you don't want to modify your system to accept this new information, then the only other thing you can do is reject the information. You can come up with some reason why this new information cannot possibly be factual or helpful or true. And so you push it away. But Piaget says that this is the worst possible thing that you as a human can do, because by rejecting the new information, you are setting yourself up for a very, very fragile hold on the interpretational structure that you have. so that every time you encounter something else that threatens that structure, you are now going to have to fight off that information every single time because you're refusing to grapple with potential change that is going to be required because of the new information. So, I can give you an example of this within the church, which is my own family members. My stepfather is has an extremely conservative Christianity, very, very evangelical and conservative positions on a lot of things. And when I went to seminary, he was really not happy about that. He didn't think that I, as a woman, should be going to seminary in the first place, and he didn't think that I should be going to the seminary that I went to because it was all the liberals were there. And so I would come home, and being a young and gung-ho seminarian, I decided that I was going to have some intellectual battles with him and try to convince him that I was right and he was wrong. And I didn't understand why, this wasn't working out for me. Every time we would have these conversations, he would get so angry and refuse to talk to me about these things and push away any of the proofs that I brought to him. And the reason for that was because I was in a place where I had no choice but to constantly be challenging my own positions. That's basically what seminary is. The day that you step into seminary, they break down anything that you ever thought you believed so that they can help you to rebuild it in a way that is thoughtful and constructed in an intentional way. And so that had happened to me, but what I didn't understand at that time was that that doesn't happen to everyone. And so this particular person, felt that I was threatening his system, and the more I pushed, the more he had to push back, because as soon as you commit to protecting your system, now you have to protect it again and again and again. And the more times you protected it, the more you've invested in it, the more dangerous it is to open it up to any kind of criticism, any kind of change. Does that make sense to everybody? That if challenge A is rejected, then you've already got that little bit of dissonance in your mind. So when challenge B comes along, you're going to be a little bit more belligerent about pushing challenge B away. And the more challenges that stack up that you've rejected, the more is at stake. Because when you get to challenge Z, and challenge Z is the one that finally breaks you down and you can't accept anymore that what you're believing can possibly be true in light of all this evidence. It's not just challenge Z that you have to figure out how to accommodate into your system. It's all of it. The whole house of cards comes crumbling down. And so that's the problem with refusing to engage new information, refusing to have any kind of interplay, kind of refusing that dialogue stage. And when it comes to the interactions between people, I think that what we have to keep in mind is obviously not everybody is at the same place in terms of willingness to be challenged and grow, especially when it comes to faith. And so if we are the person who is bringing the new information or attempting to, have that actual dialogue, not just the dialogue between a concept and my ideas, but an actual dialogue between my ideas and your ideas, that the first thing we have to do is make sure that we are being very careful about honoring where the other person is in terms of their own comfort, but also hopefully within the relationship that we've built with that person, to challenge them to do that. Not because we think that we're right, but because it is only in the dialogue between two ideas or between two people that anybody can grow. And so openness to your own growth and the growth of the other person is really the only way that that positive change can happen. But to cut ourselves off from the possibility of changing our particular system is really dangerous psychologically, because it can It can build and build and build and build until it feels like the entire world has crumbled down. Whereas if we had started from the beginning and said, okay, this new information is a little bit dissonant, why don't I grapple with that and take care of the situation and then allow that to become part of my system. And I'm not saying that, every piece of information that comes to you, you are required to accept it at face value. But the idea is that you have to grapple with it. You can't just reject it outright or pretend like it's not there. And I think that is, for personal growth and personal psychological wellness, I think that's a really important idea. So for Piaget, then after you either assimilate, which is the easy step, just bring it on in, or accommodate, do the hard work of grappling with this new information, figure out how it is going to modify your current system and bring it in as either a negative or a positive new interpretational concept. Then finally you reach equilibrium. And that is, for him, that is how you grow. That is how you maintain a healthy psyche. If you don't assimilate or accommodate, then you have to live in that place of disequilibrium, and that creates mental exhaustion, that creates spiritual exhaustion. So the best thing to do is just suck it up and do the work, basically. So any questions about Piaget?
How long ago was he, Katie, or is he current?
He's an old guy. He's from early 20th century.
Okay.
Instead of old guy, we use the word veteran of life.
Well, he's dead, so he's not a veteran anymore.
Oh,
Right, but he was very important in establishing how we teach.
Yes.
In
Social
education classes, you study Piaget.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to step away from kind of just general concepts and more into some of the theological ideas. And my tree guys have finished their lunch, so hopefully they won't be so loud that you can't hear me anymore, but let me know if you have any problems with that. So as we develop in our own growth, physical growth from childhood into being teens and then into being adults, there are two theological methodologies that we kind of absorb without ever intentionally developing them in ourselves. So the first, I'm calling this the pre-examined theologies. The first theology that we absorb, that we take on for ourselves, is called intuitive theology. These are this is a set of beliefs that goes around the reflective stage. So we just kind of base our beliefs or actions on what feels right. We intuit our way through our doing of theology, of living out our faith, and of believing what it is that we believe. So if someone were to ask me, well, why do you believe that why do you believe in ghosts? Why do you believe there are dead people's spirits floating around the world? I would say, well, I just know. I just feel it. It's there. I have no concrete evidence for it. I haven't really thought through the consequences to other elements of my life of my belief in ghosts. I just feel like that's right. I intuit it in my heart, and I know that that's true. And there's no intentional structure to my belief system. So I might believe in ghosts, but I also might believe in heaven. Well, how do I figure that out? How come some people get to go to heaven, but other people have to be stuck on earth as a spirit haunting me? What's that about? Well, I might, if somebody asks me that question, I might come up with some kind of answer. I might do a little bit of structuring, but it's mostly comes from my belief in what feels right, using other interpretations that I've heard of or used in the past. Oh, well, only the bad people have to stay and be ghosts. The good people get to go to heaven, something like that. Then the other pre-examined theology is called embedded theology. And this one isn't just kind of what I believe in personally, and has to, have the intuitive side has more to do with me and my personal experiences and my personal, collection of previous interpretations of how the world works. But embedded theology comes out of a community, of a faith community. And it grows out of the myths that you receive from that faith community. And I use the word myths in a very loose way here. For Christians, the myths of who it is that we are as a community and who I am as a member of that community come from the Bible, from the stories that we read in the Bible. It also comes from the stories of our particular faith community that are told to me. So the myths of how our community was founded, the patriarchs and matriarchs of our particular faith community, the story of how our altar was donated by the great-great-grandfather of yada yada, a person who is still a member of this congregation, and aren't you glad to be related to that person? Doesn't it feel like an honor to you that you get to be part of that legacy? Those types of stories are just as important to this embedded theology as the stories that are more universal, the stories of the Bible, the stories of Jesus, the stories of church history, the stories of, for Lutherans, Martin Luther, those types of things. And so we get our truth from the images and the language of those stories. But we don't reflect on it. We don't intentionally take those lessons that we get from those stories and create a structured theological construct for ourselves and for how we understand how the world works. We just take the stories, and whatever works in that particular situation is going to be what works. So there's no consistency across the way that we're responding to the world using either of these theologies. It's just all about what feels right and which story and what it is that we learned about from that story fits in this particular situation. So trying to move beyond intuitive or embedded theology is what we're going to do here. And I'm not suggesting certainly that, across the board, every single one of you and every single person that you encounter is going to be stuck in one of those places. All of us, to some degree, have been forced to move beyond those in our lives, because every single one of us has come across one of those coming up short moments. And it's in the coming up short moments that we are forced, to some degree at least, to make a conscious decision. And whether that conscious decision is, I'm going to grapple with this and figure it out and assimilate it or accommodate it, or I'm going to reject it and I'm going to, push off that hard work of figuring out how this fits or doesn't fit into what I believe. Those conscious choices move us beyond the intuitive and the embedded, whether we realize it or not. Because again, the biggest challenge to doing practical theology in our regular lives is not getting complacent, because we are natural interpreters as humans. And so the easiest thing to do is to just let that autopilot take over and allow ourselves to just do what feels right or do what we would have done in the past, allow our pre-understanding, that collection of previous interpretations to guide us, rather than interpreting the new thing in an intentional and thoughtful way, so that we can respond in the most faithful way possible to what God is asking us to do. So when we do practical theological reflection, we have to bring some awarenesses with us. And the first awareness is of the commitments and assumptions that we bring with us to the task of doing theology. So thinking about some of the some of our past interpretations. What is our pre-understanding? I, as an individual, have had all of these different experiences in my life. I have, encountered new information, and I have interpreted it, and I have brought it into my system. So what is that system? What does that look like for me? And there's no right or wrong answer when we're talking about this. This is not a judgment call kind of thing. This is more about being aware of who I am. Who am I right now? So that when our biases, or when our previous experiences and previous interpretations impact what it is that we're trying to work through, we are aware of that impact. That's the most important thing. It's not that we can stop those things from impacting us, because there's no such thing as completely unbiased theology. But being aware of our biases, being aware of what we bring with us, is the way that we work within the systems that that we create, that we bring with us. Also bringing with us the awareness of the interdependence of the system. If you have your system set up in your mind of how theology works, how God works in the world, how you are in relationship with God, how this person that you're working with is in relationship with you and with God, and new information, a new interpretive moment comes along, when you are in that dialogue space, when you're grappling with this new information, you have to be aware that it's all connected. So like I said before about the apple, the green apple isn't just going to modify your concept of apple, it's also going to alter your concept of pear. It's going to alter your concept of several other slightly different, but also, similar ideas. And so you have to be aware of how those changes are happening, so that you can make sure that you're maintaining the integrity of your theological system to the best of your ability. Another very important one is being aware of the presence of the Holy Spirit. So this is doing theology in our daily lives. Acting on our faith as a verb is not an easy task, but we do know that when we do these things, the Holy Spirit is present with us. And so it's not something that we have to do alone. It's not something that we have to feel completely ill-equipped to handle, because God is present with us. And in the Bible, God promises that we will not, some interpretations use the word, we will not be tempted beyond what we can bear. But, we will not be asked to encounter situations that we can't handle. God has given us the tools, God equips us, and God empowers us, and God is there with us as we wrestle with these things. And certainly that can bring comfort. So the kind of pre-work that we need to do before we start to do practical theology is to ask some questions. Who am I, and what do I bring with me in terms of previous experience, whether that be considered baggage, negative previous experience that may stop me from doing a good job of interpreting a particular situation, or benefits, positive experiences that may assist me in addressing this particular situation. So for example, when I was a very young child, I was 5 years old when my parents got divorced. And I always felt like that was baggage. That was a bad thing. I was told several times by different people in churches that it's sinful that my parents are divorced, and that, it makes me somehow a bad person to be part of a family that, is part of this divorce. And I don't know how that really works, because I didn't have a choice in the matter. I was 5. But anyway, I grew up a little bit more, and when I was 14, my best friend's family fell apart, and her parents got divorced. And so even though that experience of the divorce in my family was negative for me at that time, it was actually a benefit to me when I was interpreting and helping my friend to navigate this situation that she found herself in. And so the experiences, when I say negative and positive, when I say baggage or benefit, I don't mean that there is some kind of, flat judgment of our experiences, whether they are positive or negative. I mean that for a particular situation that you're in, what do I bring with me that can help? And what do I bring with me that, if I'm not very careful, might hinder my attempts to faithfully respond in this situation? Questions about those things? Comments? Either I'm being super clear, or you're just all super bored or completely lost. Which one is it?
I'm observing the last one,
What do you think?
Yeah.
that it's very accurate.
Well, you're making sense. That's good.
Okay, good. All right, so the next concept that I want to talk to you a little about is called theological rocks. So if I am looking at this cup and I want to get all of these rocks into the cup,
Oh,
I might just start picking up rocks and sticking them in the cup.
I should call them about this.
But I get to this point and I look over and I realize, uh-oh, there is a large rock left that is not going to fit into this cup. I have to rethink what I'm doing here. So the theological rocks idea is about putting the first things at the front. And theological rocks are different for every person. One of my theological rocks is that God created us and calls us to do something in the world. So we are here for no reason. We are here because God placed us on this earth, and we are here for a purpose. And I don't just mean that, I exist so that one time I'm walking across a bridge and a duck is, baby duck is about to fall to his death down in the embankment, that I can save the duck, and then that's the whole purpose of my life, that one thing. That's not what I mean. I mean that my entire life, my entire being, if I respond to God's call in this world, that I will be fulfilled, because the reason why I am here is to live in this way, to be in these relationships, to serve people in these particular ways that God has created for me. And so that's one of my theological rocks. So I have to, as I encounter theological situations that I need to interpret, if I am committed to that thing, I have to put that rock in first, because it's huge. Most important.
That's a white reminder.
It's a large rock. Another one might be that God is all about love. God's love has to be paramount to anything that I do. God is not in the business of judging people and hating people and bringing death to people. God is in the business of loving people and bringing life and wholeness. And so that might be a theological rock, that the big boulders that have to go into the cup first. And so again, this is not something that there is a right and wrong answer for. This is about you reflecting for yourself about, what are my theological boulders? What are the biggest rocks that I have to make sure go into the cup of my interpretive process first, so that they will fit? Because if I don't remember them in the situations that I get myself into, then I'm going to get myself into trouble, because I'll add everything in and then suddenly I'll be missing something. So once you get those boulders in there, then new, smaller concepts will be able to fit in. But again, we talked about how it's not just in that dialogue, in that fusion, it's not just the concepts themselves that are fit in, that are changed, but sometimes our previous understanding has to change. And sometimes even our theology has to change. And sometimes even those boulders have to change because of the new information that we've encountered. And so that humility the humility that we need to keep in mind that we aren't perfect and that the systems that we create for ourselves aren't perfect is important to keep in mind. So does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah,
Yes.
so Katie, does that mean that the big rocks break down into smaller rocks, or what happens to them?
In those situations where things have to really change?
Yeah,
I think sometimes I think we do have to break them down or remove them or make them smaller in terms of their priority, because new priorities come across, and especially as we change and grow and our contexts change, where we are, who we're with, who we are as individuals, we have to be willing to take another look at those. Now, I would say, the bigger ones are less likely to move easily, because I think the feel
yeah,
of the rocks concept is, I've talked a lot previously about the flexibility, about being willing to change, about being willing to be open to new information, not just as a challenge to you, but as an opportunity to grow. But in theology, we also have some things that are pretty solid, are pretty, do need to be the kind of where the buck stops. We can't go beyond this.
right,
And so the
right,
theological rocks, I think, help us to the metaphor of the rocks helps us to kind of conceptualize that in the cup, we've got these big rocks that are fairly immovable, that must go in first. But they're still rocks. They could still be chipped away at, they could still be modified. And at some points, in really big situations that really, turn our whole worlds upside down, some of those big rocks won't even go back in, potentially, depending on the situation. But I think the bigger the rock, the more primary the idea about who God is, or who you are, or how we interact in the world, or what our purpose is. The bigger the rock, the more likely it is that we are going to hold on to that a little bit more firmly when we encounter new information, so that we're not coming at this task in a wishy-washy manner, as if everything we've ever experienced could just be thrown out the window in a second. There are some things that it's appropriate to hold on to as we navigate the world. There are some truths that, capital T truths, that are going to be harder for us, and should be harder for us to move as new information comes along to us. But we have to make sure that we keep those things at the forefront. And again, we have to make sure that we are aware of what those things are, so that when we encounter situations that we have to try to navigate through, we are aware, yes, this is a primary idea that is at play here, and this is something that I am unwilling to move on unless I have overwhelming evidence that it's not going to work. Just the awareness of where we are. Ben, you're shaking your head. What's going on?
Well, it's just you've made a beautiful picture of what happens, but I found in my years at SEM discussing theology that a stronger point, rather than the logic or philosophy, is the emotion. We were able to convince each other logically to change our mind about things, but you never believed it. All right, A equals C because A equals B equals C, but it never really took hold, because emotion is in there, your strong emotion, and that's what I think has to be considered. And I think there are very few large rocks that we really have to consider. The others are really, I don't know, at my age, I think really get kind of meaningless to me. And I agree with you about SEM, that they do try to break you down and break your faith down and change your faith. But what they're trying to do is what we discovered was that they're trying to make your faith into their faith, the way that they believe. So we all believe the same. I'm talking about Missouri Synod. That was my experience. But I like what you're doing in that you're painting a picture of the logical mind.
Yeah, and I think it's important too to that yes, emotion, our feelings are not rejected from this system. That as we navigate through these things, that theological rocks can certainly have emotion to them, can have the strength of conviction behind them, but to think about, why do I feel so emotionally attached to this idea? Why is it so important to me? And to be able to articulate that to yourself and to other people, I think is what we're attempting to do here. Not because the emotion itself is bad, but because if we allow the emotion to control us, then it's possible, not guaranteed, but possible, that emotion will lead us away from the place that God is calling us to go next, to the new understandings that God is trying to bring us to. Not because the emotion itself is bad, but because the emotion is unexamined.
I found just the opposite, that my emotion tends to lead me in the way God wants me to go, by my pathos and the way I feel about people and things. That's my emotion that drives me into situations, and I believe God puts me there. But once again, it's all up in the air about the whole thing. So
Yeah, and the emotion certainly can also, I mentioned before about being aware of the Holy Spirit's presence in the process. And definitely a lot of times our experience of the Holy Spirit is emotional, is that kind of gut, is that heart stuff. It's not as much the brain stuff. And I'm not saying that the Holy Spirit doesn't act through brains. I certainly hope that the Holy Spirit is with me when I am, for example, writing a sermon, and gives me the words to say, even though the words are formulating in my head. I hope that is the case. Certainly you don't want your sermon to just be you and your words, but I think it's still just that awareness of, where is this impetus coming from, where is this motivation coming from, why is it that I feel that this is the place to go. Let me think about my emotions. Let me think about the reasons why this is happening in this way. And if the answer to that question is, that I think that the Holy Spirit is guiding me in this direction because I've put God's love at the front of my mind. My biggest theological rock is that God is all about love, and so this is the loving response in my mind and in my heart, because I feel is what God is calling me to do. Then that's this process too. It's not just about leaving your feelings at the door and doing this in a cold, logical type of way. It's just about the ability to stop and say, why am I feeling this way? Why am I doing this? So that you can feel confident that you are proceeding in the right way. And when you're in situations where new information comes up, like I said before, it has to do with that coming up short. So there are going to be situations where you encounter new information and you do not come up short. You can very easily assimilate. You don't have to change your system at all. The response is automatic and you can continue to move forward. The problem that we're trying to address here is those situations where you come up short. What am I going to do? I don't have enough information to address this situation in a way that I think is faithful to what God is calling me to do. And so I've got to wrestle with this. I've got to get into that dialogue. I've got to find that fusion so that I can apply it. And Certainly, not every situation is going to require this process. This is what I'm attempting to do is work on the hardest possible situation so that anything that comes easier than that will happen a lot more smoothly. You certainly don't have to sit down for every single decision you make. And, for the next 4 weeks, we're going to talk about a question that you need to ask yourself in this process. I'm not suggesting that, okay, so what does God want me to have for breakfast this morning? Wheaties or Cheerios? I've got to ask myself these questions. Well, what's going on here? And why is it going on? And what ought to be going on? Obviously, that is not what we're trying to do here. But when we think about the hardest possible situations, the really challenging situations that we find ourselves in, if we have these tools in our pocket to do it in an intentional, step-by-step way for those situations, then some of those tools will kind of trickle into our subconscious and even the way that we encounter the world on a daily basis will become a little bit more intentional, a little bit more reflective. And I think that's where we want to be. We want to be in a place where we are aware of what God is doing with us. We are aware of what we are doing and how it impacts other people and how it impacts other aspects of our lives. So I think that's what I'm trying to get at with this. Is that helpful? Great. Any other thoughts about theological rocks or anything else we've talked about so far? Okay.
Me.
So just a few keys to keep in mind as we go. So the theological rocks, principle first things, put in the big rocks first or they won't fit. Make sure that you don't get distracted in the situation by the details of the situation, that you forget what is paramount to you. And so homework assignment number 1 for this week is going to be that I'd like for you all to think about what are some of your theological rocks? What are the foundational concepts about God, about humanity, about Jesus, that you must bring with you when you are attempting to interpret the world around you. And like I said, those are going to be different for everybody, and there are no right or wrong answers to those questions. But to make sure that we are keeping those things in mind and aware of what those things are for us as individuals, I think is the best way to have a good foundation for what it is that we're trying to do. We also want to attempt to avoid that intuitive embedded model. What feels right might not always be right, or you might not be able to figure out what feels right at all. So that's that coming up short. If you are moving along, just doing what feels right to you, and then suddenly you encounter a situation where you don't know what feels right, that's that coming up short. That's that place where you have to then start to dialogue and modify. And this is not, like I said, this is not about saying that you can't follow your feelings, that you can't follow your gut in any situation, but just being aware that that's what's happening, that that's what you're doing, and why it is that you're doing that is the goal. I think the goal is to move beyond intuitive embedded, not because you no longer value those things, you no longer value your feelings, you no longer value the stories of your faith and the stories of your faith community, but that you are aware of how those things are influencing your behavior and your decisions. So I think that's a really important distinction. So I'm not suggesting that we reject these foundational theologies that most of us start with, but I'm asking that we be aware of how they are impacting the way that we are making our decisions. Does that make sense? Okay. I've mentioned this before, but humility, being open to change and growth, being aware that we are not perfect, that we don't always have all the answers, and that when we are approaching, a situation, maybe a person, we're not just there to convince them, to change them. We're there to be changed, to grow for ourselves, and to develop a relationship together so that hopefully we can move forward and develop that relationship further. And then being aware that, you know, even those theological rocks might change. We know that doing theology is going to change us. It's going to change our relationships. It's going to change our perspectives. It's going to change the way that we interpret the world. But it's also possible that the theology itself, the rocks, the concepts that we bring with us, the assumptions that we bring about who God is, who we are, how the world works, may also need to change if it no longer is working in your context, in the situations that you're encountering. But like I said, the reason why we have the theological rocks is not so that we can hold on to them so tightly that they never can be released, they never can be reduced, but so that we have a place to start, so that we're not coming at it completely unprepared, completely wishy-washy. We want to honor the past experiences, the past interpretations. We want to say, hey, you know, I'm not an idiot. I haven't spent my entire life doing everything wrong. Here are some things that, at least up to this point in my life, I know to be right. I know to be the correct thing to do, to be, to act, to think. But I am not going to hold on to those things so hard that I will never, ever, 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 ever let them go no matter what. I'm going to hold on to them pretty strongly, knowing that thus far they've worked really well, but I'm going to have the humility to hold them loosely enough that if something huge or several things that, you know, slowly kind of eat away at it come along, I am not going to reject those things. I'm not going to allow myself to live in that space of disequilibrium for the rest of my life. I'm going to open my hand very cautiously and embrace this change, embrace the new information, have that dialogue, do that hard work of looking at how do these things interplay, how do I interact with this, how do I change what it is that I believe and who it is that I am, how do I assimilate this, or how do I accommodate this new information. I know that that's a lot. What questions do we have about that? Nothing.
I'm processing it.
Yeah, it's going to take some thinking.
Well, an example that I don't know, I think it's an example. Looking back at the Daniel study
Okay.
and the notion that maybe Daniel's a fictional character. What do you mean by that? How can that be? Daniel's always been a real character my whole life, right?
Uh-huh. Right.
And so being maybe open to understanding that it's God's word we're looking for in there, as opposed to, you know, some of it is people's interpretation of what happened, or, you know, myths or stories from the past. So that was all a new concept for me.
Mm-hmm. And being
to wrestle with.
having that humility to encounter that new information, and having the you know, the convictions. I think the strength of convictions is actually the foundation of that humility. Because if you don't know what you have to believe, what is foundational, what is most important, then you're potentially going to try to hold on to everything too tightly and never change, and then you end up in that space of disequilibrium really easily for for basically over nothing, over something that is not worth having that kind of spiritual agony over. Okay, so I know we're getting along on time here, but I want to just quickly run through this. So the 4 tasks of practical theological reflection are what we're actually going to talk about in this course. For the next 4 weeks, we're going to talk about these 4 tasks. So when we encounter a situation where we don't know what to do, where we, have that moment of being challenged beyond what our previous interpretational structure can handle. This is the way that we can help ourselves to navigate through that in a way that is going to guide us toward the most faithful possible response and how to deal with the situation. So the first task that we, this says number 1, but before number 0 is all the stuff that we've talked about so far. Being aware of our theological rocks, being aware of the baggage and benefits that we bring with us, being aware of our past interpretational experiences, so that when we come up against this situation, we know what our biases are. We know what kind of benefits, what kinds of tools we bring with us. But we also know where our personal gaps are. Some places where we don't have enough experience, or we've had negative experiences, or we have bias against a particular situation that is going to impact the way that we encounter and address it. And that's not to say that you can't encounter or address something that you have bias in relationship to, but just being aware of that bias will help you to navigate around it, or to try to ameliorate it in some way as you're working through. So all those things we've already talked about are kind of the pre-work. When we get into the actual situation that we're talking about, we do these 4 things. The first thing we do is we ask the question, what is going on? We stop and we say, let's reflect on the situation itself. We're not going to try to interpret the situation. We're just going to express the situation. We're going to describe what's happening. Then we're going to do the interpretive task. We're going to ask, why is this going on? Dig a little bit deeper down. Third, we're going to do the theological task. What should be going on? What's the difference between what is going on and what should be going on? And so this is where we get into some of those theological rocks. What is it that we believe about God that helps us to understand what God would want to happen in this situation? And then fourth, how might I respond, or how might we respond? What do we do after we've done this pondering of these other 3 questions? So for the rest of our course, the next 4 weeks, we're going to talk about one of these tasks, one of these questions each week, and get into a little bit about what each of them means and how we do it. And so then the second homework that I'd like you to work on this week, in addition to thinking about what your theological rocks are, is I'd like you to think about a situation where you have come up short, that you could benefit from this process in navigating through. And what I'm asking you for doesn't have to be you bearing your soul to us with a situation that's really difficult for you right now to talk about, that's going to bring up a lot of raw emotion. If you want it to be, I think this group is a safe place for some of that, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be something that happened a long time ago that still irks you because you feel like you did the wrong thing. Or it can be, a fairly innocuous kind of situation that's bothering you right now, but it's, you really want to work through it and wrestle with it and figure out what to do. And not everybody has to share. We don't have to go through every single person, but if we could have some people who are willing to share their stories and we can kind of walk through these together, then I think that would be a more beneficial way to do this than for me to continue to just lecture at you for the next 4 weeks. And we can actually get some examples of how you do this in real life and not just the theory behind it. So quickly before we go, I wanted to show you how this whole process, how this whole system works within a context. And I want to look at a story from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is a perfect example in this story of a practical theologian, of somebody who's doing this task of figuring out how to behave in a faithful manner in a particular situation. So I will just read this quickly and then we can go through it. So this is Mark chapter 2. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath." So this is Jesus doing those 4 tasks of theology. So task number 1 is the interpretive task. What is going on here? So what's happening?
Well, they're hungry.
They're hungry.
They're hungry. They're walking
Mm-hmm.
and they're hungry. So they choose to eat what's available to them, the heads of the grain.
Mm-hmm. And so what's the problem?
They didn't ask permission. But then this
It's
is way
Sabbath.
back when. Did you ask permission when you were walking through a field of grain if there was nobody around to ask permission?
Okay, so there is no permission. But what else is the problem? What are the Pharisees saying is the problem?
Oh, you can't do this on the Sabbath. You're
Right.
not supposed to do anything on the Sabbath.
Right. So plucking heads of grain is work, and we are not allowed to work on the Sabbath. So what is going on? What the conflict is that the disciples are breaking the law, right? So the next question is the interpretational task. The question, what or why is this going on? So why is this happening? Judy, you kind of already said some of it.
They were hungry.
Right. So the disciples are hungry. They have biological needs. But why is that a conflict? Why are the Pharisees responding in this way?
They were looking for anything they could do to bring Jesus up before the court, whatever they could do.
Okay.
They were working to find whatever they could do so they could bring him before the judges.
Okay. So that's really interesting because that is a different interpretation than I bring, but that's why this is called the interpretive task. So Judy is interpreting the Pharisees as acting in bad faith. They are just attempting to find reasons to get Jesus into trouble. I don't think that that's wrong. I certainly don't think that that's wrong. I don't know off the top of my head what comes before and after this in the book of Mark. This is only chapter 2, so we do have a little bit of potential wiggle room in terms of what the Pharisees are at here. They could potentially, we could interpret them in a little bit more positive light, and we could say they are trying to protect God's law, right? God told us that we aren't supposed to work on the Sabbath. We're supposed to honor the Sabbath. It's right there in the 10 Commandments, the most important laws of the whole Bible that summarize the whole deal, that we are supposed to honor the Sabbath day. We're not supposed to work. These guys are working. How dare they? And so those are 2 different potential interpretations, and whichever interpretation we decide to go with is going to change the way that we move forward with the other questions. So that's really interesting. So then moving on to question number 3, the theological task. What should be going on? What ought to be going on here, do we think?
Well, he gave the example of David and, entering the house of God. But I think that he was trying to point out, that when you're hungry and you're in need of food, then maybe the law isn't so lawful.
Okay. Yeah. So so Jesus uses our theological sources, you know, in the why is this happening, we can look at all kinds of different things. We can look at social systems theories, we can look at psychology and anthropology and all that type of thing to figure out why is this happening. But when we ask the theological question, then our sources of information, our research should be from God. It should, so he uses the scripture. He looks back at the scripture and he says, what ought to be going on here? Well, what did David do? When they were hungry, they ate the bread of the presence, even though they weren't supposed to do it, because what ought to be going on is that the law should be used to support human life, not to prevent us from fulfilling our needs, from serving each other. The law should support us, not confine us. The law is supposed to be a blessing, not a curse. And so Jesus answers that question, what ought to be going on, right there very nicely at the end. The Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. And so then, you know, we don't have this part of the story, but we can assume that then they do number 4, the practical task. How should I respond? Hopefully, in the conversation, the disciples, you know, ideally the disciples say, oh, okay, well, now that we figured out that this is fine, we're going to keep on eating. The Pharisees would have the humility to say, okay, well, maybe we were looking at the law a little bit in a little bit of a skewed way, and we should maybe reconsider. Obviously, they didn't do that, because by the end of this book, you know, they're up there shouting, crucify him, crucify him. But in the best world, everybody would agree that yes, we did this process together. We asked these questions. We navigated through this together, and this is the conclusion that we've come to. And so this is how we're going to behave moving forward. So was that helpful to just kind of look at this short story and do that a little bit? Give you a sense of this?
Yeah, it was a good example of the process.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, that is all I have for today, I believe. Yep. So we can get back to maybe Zoom. Go back to Zoom. Nope. Oh well, that's okay. So that's the end of our PowerPoint. Any questions or thoughts, initial feelings about all this?
I think it'll be interesting to see where this takes us.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
Yeah, this was the big theory time. So from now on, it should be a little bit more hands-on, practical, actually working through some of this stuff. I'll have a little bit of kind of introduction to each question, but then it will mostly be taking some of these things that we've talked about today and applying them to the question that we're focusing on for that week, and hopefully talking through some of our own stories and then looking at the Bible and how it can help us to navigate some of that stuff. So, we good with this? We happy with this?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, I think that we can wrap it up for today then. Do we have anybody willing to pray us out of this crazy, mind-boggling experience?
Yeah, I will.
All right. Thank you, Karen.
Lord, we thank you for leading us and teaching us and providing us with such a wonderful teacher who understands your word and is able to interpret it for us and lead us in this study. So be with us and guide us as we complete our homework for next week. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Karen. All right. Well, let me know by email if you have any questions as you're working on some of this stuff and thinking back over your notes. I'd be happy to share my PowerPoint presentation out with y'all too. I can send you a PDF version of it so that you can go back and look at some things if you'd like. And then we will gather again next week and start talking about question number 1. What is going on?
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great week.
You
Will
too.
do.
Thanks, Judy.